In this third lecture, we will look at the original texts behind the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We will also take a look at the histories that are embedded in the Old Testament, of which Ezra and Nehemiah are a part. And we will look at the chronology. There's quite a significant debate among scholars about the chronology of Ezra and Nehemiah. So if you will locate yourself at slide 23, we will begin this lecture on the texts and the histories. Slide 24. There are two histories of Israel embedded within the Hebrew Bible. The books that these involve are the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Biblical scholars, however, see these two chronologies as a little bit different from each other because some of the books fall into one and some fall into the other. The first one is typically called Deuteronomistic history. Now, this is not a biblical word. This is a word that scholars have coined to talk about a history that seems very thematically linked to the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. This particular history begins with the stories of the conquest, Joshua's invasion of the land of Canaan. Then it describes the period of the Judges, which is sometimes called the Tribal League, when there was no king in Israel, but there were various kinds of military leaders just the same. Then in the books of Samuel, the beginning of the life of Saul and David, and eventually the kingdom that David established are described, the period of the United Monarchy. And then finally in the books of Kings, you have the reign of Solomon, the division of the monarchy, the exile of the northern nation, and the exile of the southern nation. In this history, both the northern and the southern nations are described. Even during the period of the divided monarchy, the various kings of the north, beginning with Jeroboam I, extending all the way to the end of those kings with Hoshea, are described, as well as the kings in the south, which is Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, all the way to the last of the kings of Judah, which was Zedekiah. However, there exists another history, and that history begins with the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Chronicles, as you are probably aware, is more or less parallel to the books of Samuel and Kings. And along with the books of Chronicles are the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Unlike the former history, this history addresses only the kingdom of Judah. It begins with the genealogies and gives special prominence to the genealogies of Judah and Benjamin. It describes the life of David and the life of Solomon. It describes the history of Judah and the various kings of Judah, beginning with Rehoboam all the way to the end of the southern kingdom and the exile. But it does not address the history of the north other than just in some very cursory ways. As you move into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, it will describe the return of the Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And so this particular history focuses upon particularly the southern nation. Keeping that in mind then, if you look at slide 25, you will see a description of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible comes to us in three large collections. The first one, the Torah, is what sometimes we call also the Pentateuch or the books of Moses. The second collection is called the prophets or the Nebiim, and is divided into two sections, the former prophets and the latter prophets. If you look carefully, you will see that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which is what earlier we call the Deuteronomistic history, those form a section called the former prophets in the Hebrew Bible. Now, in our English Bibles, we have some other books that are associated and sometimes interposed between those books. But in the Hebrew Bibles, these four scrolls occurred simply as they are listed, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Then, of course, you have the latter prophets, which are the books that we more typically think of prophets. The third column shows the third collection in the Hebrew Bible, which is called the Ketubim, or the writings. And if you'll notice near the end of that list, in fact, right at the end of that list, you have the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and then the books of Chronicles. Now, in this particular case, Chronicles becomes the last book of the Hebrew Bible, and the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles form the end of the Hebrew Bible as it appears in Hebrew itself. Also to be noted is the fact that 1st and 2nd Chronicles were originally a single scroll, just simply called Chronicles, and they became divided later into what we call 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Also, Ezra and Nehemiah were on a single scroll, and later they were divided into Ezra and Nehemiah. And we will come to those divisions in a moment. But at least at this point, just notice that the two histories, the one history in the middle section of the Hebrew Bible and the final history at the end of the Hebrew Bible, are somewhat independent of each other, even though they do talk to a large degree about some of the same history. It is this second history, the Chronicler's history, with which we are concerned in this study. Slide 26. You should also be aware that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah come to us in two ancient languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. There is, in fact, only one other book in the Old Testament that has any substantial sections of Aramaic in it, and that is the book of Daniel. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah is entirely in Hebrew, and most of the book of Ezra is in Hebrew as well. But there are some small sections of the book of Ezra that are in the language of Aramaic. Now, we should say a bit about the language of Aramaic, because Aramaic was largely an international language of the ancient world. It was often used by governments to correspond with each other or to relate to each other. And so Aramaic, while it was in the same alphabet as Hebrew, was in fact a different language, somewhat like the fact that the same alphabet is used for English and largely for German and for Spanish and so on, even though those are different languages. Aramaic becomes the preferred language of the ancient Near East, and in fact many of the Jews who went to Babylon began to speak Aramaic when they were in Babylon, and especially their children probably spoke Aramaic. So much was this so that by the time the Jews returned to Jerusalem, we will find in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that not everyone could even speak Hebrew any longer. Some people had already made the change over to Aramaic. And in the reading of the Torah, which was in Hebrew, the Hebrew language had to be translated into Aramaic for people who no longer understood Hebrew. So at least keep in mind that in the Old Testament there are two languages. And most of the Old Testament, almost all of the books are written in Hebrew, except there are a few portions of the book of Ezra and a few sections of the book of Daniel that are written in Aramaic. Slide 27. A word also should be said about the canonical listing of the books of the Old Testament. You may be aware that there is a difference between the canons that exist in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches as opposed to the canon that is used by the Protestants and the Jews. Catholic and Orthodox Christians early on read the Septuagint and did so for 1,000 years before there was any division between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church and later the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And in the Septuagint, there was a collection of books which since has come to be called the apocrypha, a number of books that were written in the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. For our study, this is important because there are two of these books called 1st and 2nd Esdras, which cover the same history as the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So while we will not be looking at the apocryphal books as a whole, we will, on occasion, have reason to reference 1st Esdras and 2nd Esdras because of the common history that they have with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The Protestants and the Jews, of course, do not accept the apocrypha as canonical. They may consider them to be important books, and in fact, some Protestant Bibles will have the apocryphal books in them. For instance, the Revised Standard Version has an edition with the apocryphal books in them, and you can read them there. And of course, you could pick up any Roman Catholic Bible, the New American Bible, or the Jerusalem Bible. Those certainly would have the apocryphal books in them. But by and large, Protestants do not read the apocryphal books as canonical, even though some of them contain some quite important history. And so while these lectures are really given from the Protestant viewpoint, There will be times when we will reference 1st Esdras and 2nd Esdras as important historical documents that supplement the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah. Slide 28. Here is where language can become a bit of a problem, because the books of 1st and 2nd Esdras that we just mentioned, and the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which we are studying, sometimes appear titled differently in different editions of the Bible. First of all, we need to remember that the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek a couple of centuries before the time of Jesus. This Hebrew version of the Bible, translated into Greek, was called the Septuagint. And so the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible contained the books not only of Ezra and Nehemiah, but also the books of 1st and 2nd Esdras. However, they were not titled quite the same way. You remember me saying that Ezra and Nehemiah originally was a single scroll. And so it wasn't called Ezra and Nehemiah in the Septuagint, it was called Esdras B. You'll see in the 3rd register of this little chart that Ezra and Nehemiah corresponds to Ezra B. Then the book of 1st Esdras, which was in the apocrypha, came to be called Esdras A in the Septuagint translation into Greek. When you're reading the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, you don't find 1st Esdras or 2nd Esdras because these were not canonical for the Hebrews. But you do find Ezra and Nehemiah. And in the English versions of the Bible, you find Ezra and Nehemiah just as you're used to seeing them. And if you have a Bible that has the apocrypha, there you will find 1st and 2nd Esdras. And those will be the way they appear in the Roman Catholic versions of the Bible, as well as Protestant versions that have the apocrypha. Perhaps the most confusing part is in the Latin Vulgate, which probably you're not going to be reading, but if you were reading the Latin Vulgate, unfortunately, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Esdras, are titled 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Esdras. So 1st Esdras in the Vulgate corresponds to the book of Ezra in the English Bible. 2nd Esdras in the Latin Vulgate corresponds to Nehemiah in the English Bible. 3rd Esdras in the Latin Vulgate corresponds to 1st Esdras in the English Bible, and 4th Esdras in the Latin Vulgate corresponds to 2nd Esdras in the English Bible. Now, I suppose all of this seems rather confusing, but for our purposes here, it's probably important for you simply to remember that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, as we're used to reading them in the Bible, we will be referring to them by those names. And when we use the titles 1st Esdras and 2nd Esdras, we will be referring to the apocrypha books that cover some of the same history, but were written later in the intertestamental period. Slide 29. Since Ezra and Nehemiah originally were a single scroll, the question sometimes comes up whether or not it should be considered as a single book. And does it have a single author? Formally, these two books, Ezra and Nehemiah, were separated relatively late, but they certainly existed for a long period of time simply as a single scroll. They were together in the Septuagint. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, they appeared as Esdras B, even though they were different than the apocryphal works that was called Esdras A. The division of Ezra and Nehemiah into two different books began in about the 3rd century in the Christian era, and they were divided by Christians as early as Origen, which was one of the early church fathers. Finally, when Jerome began to translate the Bible into Latin, what is called the Latin Vulgate, these books were clearly divided, and they were titled 1st and 2nd Esdras, which we mentioned with respect to the last slide. The Jews, however, did not divide these books until the 15th century A.D. They long had the opinion that probably there were two books there and that they may actually have been by different authors, the one by Ezra, the other by Nehemiah. And in fact, this is reflected in the Jewish Talmud, which is the recorded tradition of the Jews. But formally, at least, they were not divided until the 15th century. However, if today you would read a Jewish Bible, such as the one by the Jewish Publication Society, you will find that Ezra and Nehemiah have been divided into two books called Ezra and Nehemiah, just like they are in the Protestant Bible. The issue is still sometimes debated as to whether or not Ezra and Nehemiah should be considered to be a single book or two. But by this time, in the early 21st century, most scholars agree that it is unlikely that these two books were composed as a single work. They seem to have been composed by two different authors, and there are some distinguishing marks between the two books that seem to separate them into two different works. We will follow that assumption in this study, and we will continue our work in Ezra and Nehemiah as though they are two different books written by two different authors, but both belonging to the extended history that is sometimes called the chronicler's history. Slide 30. We also need to say a bit about the chronology of Ezra and Nehemiah, because this has become quite a debatable issue among scholars. If you attend classes at any of the major universities in Europe or in America, and if in the classes that you take, you study this part of Hebrew history, you will run into this chronological issue. Part of the issue has to do with trying to harmonize the data that is in Ezra with the data that is in Nehemiah. If you simply read Ezra and Nehemiah straightforwardly as they appear in your English Bible, it would seem pretty straightforward. Ezra seems to come first. He brings with him a group of people. They arrive in Jerusalem after some others have already arrived earlier. Ezra begins a reform movement, and you get to the end of his book. And then you get to the book of Nehemiah, which comes later. And Nehemiah comes during the reign of Artaxerxes of Persia. That certainly is later than the reign of that was under the time of Ezra. And there doesn't seem to be any problem until you actually try to coordinate the data in these two books. Now, the primary objection by some scholars is that if Ezra's reforms were earlier than Nehemiah, then why did Nehemiah seem to have to repeat them? Some of the same problems that you find in the book of Ezra, you also find in the book of Nehemiah. And if those earlier problems were not resolved by Ezra, why then does Nehemiah come later, and why is he not recognized as the father of Judaism? But in fact, uniformly, Ezra is credited as being the father of Judaism. So given that Judaism was so thoroughly shaped by Ezra, the idea of Nehemiah coming later is sometimes questioned by scholars, and they wonder how that could be. Another issue for them is what appears to be a lengthy gap of time between the arrival of Ezra, which is described in Ezra chapter 7, and his reading publicly of the Torah, which is not described until in the book of Nehemiah. 13 years would separate the arrival of Nehemiah from his public reading of the Torah in the book of, 13 years would describe Ezra's arrival in the book of Ezra from his reading of the Torah in the book of Nehemiah. 13 years is a long time. So why would Ezra wait so long before beginning his teaching office? That's the question that is sometimes raised. And so many university scholars recommend that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah need to be restructured so that Ezra, the first few chapters of Ezra come first, and then the book of Nehemiah is sandwiched into the middle of the book of Ezra, usually between chapter 6 and 7, and then you get the end of the book of Nehemiah. And so if you restructure these two leaders in this way, you come up with a rather different order than you have in your English Bible. Slide 32. This slide describes the two chronologies. The first block on the left describes the traditional chronology, and the second block on the right describes the historical critical chronology, which you would find more typical in the universities. Actually, let's start with the second one first. In the historical critical chronology, the history of Ezra and Nehemiah is restructured from the order that it appears in your English Bible. In this particular case, Nehemiah would come before Ezra. So the early return of the Jews from Babylon, of course, comes under the leadership of Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, as we will talk about when we actually get to those chapters. Then after them would come Nehemiah and his reforms, which were partly successful, but not completely successful. And then after Ezra, or after the end of the book of Nehemiah, comes Ezra beginning chapter 7 through the end of the book. So when Ezra comes with the Torah and begins reading the Torah, his reading of the Torah should be connected with his arrival, not 13 years later. This would solve the problem for many scholars of why there was this big gap between the arrival of Ezra in Jerusalem and his beginning to read the Torah. And they would say there's no gap at all. Ezra arrived, he begins to read the Torah, but this is all after the coming of Nehemiah. One of the big problems, however, with this restructuring of the chronology is that there are two specific dates that are given, one in Ezra and one in Nehemiah, and both would have to be wrong. In Ezra chapter 7 and verse 7, it says quite clearly that the arrival of Ezra happens in the 7th year of the king Artaxerxes, which is the king of Persia, or the emperor of Persia. But if you go to Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1, you will discover that Nehemiah is going to come in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. This is where you get that 13-year gap. So if the historical critical chronology is correct, then these dates in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah are incorrect. And those of us who believe in the integrity of the Bible and its historical trustworthiness certainly flinch at the idea that there are dates in Ezra and Nehemiah that are incorrect. And so that brings us back actually to the traditional chronology. If we follow the traditional chronology, we also will recognize that there is not any textual material that would suggest a dislocation in the chapters of Ezra and Nehemiah. If Nehemiah came before Ezra, we would have to actually have Nehemiah in the middle of the book of Ezra. And there is no text that suggests such a thing. Whether in the Hebrew Bible, in the Septuagint, or even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's nothing that would suggest that Ezra and Nehemiah had some sort of textual dislocation. The dates for Nehemiah, on the other hand, seem pretty solid. That he came in the 20th year of Artaxerxes is very easily correlated with some manuscripts called the Elephantine Papyri, which are 5th century documents that were written by Jews in Egypt. And these manuscripts put Sanballat as a contemporary of Artaxerxes I, which would agree with what is said in the book of Nehemiah. Furthermore, if we take the public reading of the Torah that's described in the book of Nehemiah as being the end of Ezra's reforms rather than the beginning of his reforms, then there's not really a problem. Ezra would have come, just as he says, in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. He would have began his reform movement, teaching the Jews, but the final public reading of the Torah would have been at the climax of his reform, not at the beginning of his reform. And so if we understand Ezra's reading of the Torah to be the climax of the reform, then we have resolved the problem of this 13-year gap. It wasn't 13 years before Ezra began his reforms. It was simply 13 years of reform that was climaxed with a reading of the Torah at the end of his reforms. So in this particular study of Ezra and Nehemiah, we're going to follow the traditional chronology. You should be aware, however, of the historical critical chronology simply because it is widely known and widely appealed to in the universities. But for our purposes, we're going to stick with the traditional chronology, and we will be following the books of Ezra and Nehemiah just as they are written in your English Bible. This ends our 3rd lecture.